In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And a man standing beside the same machine for 43 years because nobody has found a reason to move him, and nobody has found a reason to kill him. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about Passen Drebb, number 64782. He was 15 and feeding a press when his supervisor lost a hand, and the auditor charged the boy instead of the boss, because nobody has to explain a press feeder. He has been on Penal Colony Kelvadden ever since. He survived by learning the machines, because the machines are the only thing there that does not care what your number is. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. Nobody tells you about the taste. Every piece of documentation I have ever seen about Penal Colony Kelvadden, every sentencing brief, every processing form, every transit manifest, mentions the labor quotas, the atmospheric toxicity ratings, the average mortality figures. Not one of them mentions that the whole place tastes like granite powder and engine grease. Every corridor, every shaft, every dormitory, every hour of every day, for as long as you live here. After long enough, you stop noticing, which is the first sign that the colony has started to digest you. I stopped noticing in my first year. My name is Passen Drebb. My number is 64782. I have lived on Kelvadden most of my life, which makes me the oldest serving inmate in Section 7, and as far as anybody can determine from the filing, the longest-running example of administrative continuity in the subsector Hallingard penal system. That is not a compliment. It means nobody has found a reason to move me, and nobody has found a reason to kill me. And in the gap between those two facts, I have built what some people would call a life. I arrived on a bulk convict transport called the Pergament, which carried 214 inmates in a cargo hold designed for industrial freight. The Pergament was a repurposed grain hauler with the ventilation capacity of a wardrobe and the navigational precision of a thrown brick, and whoever had fitted the prisoner restraint rails into its hold had bolted them directly into the deck plating without compensating for the structural flex of a ship that had spent its working life carrying sacks of grain and had never been asked to carry anything that screamed. The rails came loose in the 6th week. A man in the row behind me had his restraint bar break free and pin him to the deck by his chest, and the transit guards did not come down for most of a shift because nobody on the bridge particularly cared whether we arrived as 214 or 212. He was still alive when they lifted it. He was still alive when we made planetfall, and he died upright in the processing queue on Kelvadden with his chit in his hand, which was the first piece of practical education this place ever gave me. A man can be dead for quite a while before his legs get the message. The crossing took the better part of 3 months, and the middle of it happened in the place ships go through to cross distance. There is a rule about that place, and the transit guards gave it to us once, on the first day, in the flat voice of men who had said it several hundred times. Whatever you hear through the hull, you did not hear. In the 3rd week, the lumens went the color of a bruise and stayed that way, and a man a few rows over started talking to somebody who was not in the hold with us, and he was still talking when the light came back. The guards took him out. Nobody asked. The Pergament came out where it was supposed to, which I am told is not guaranteed. The ship's own people spent the last day of the passage at prayer over the machinery that had kept the hull the right shape. And we could hear that through the deck, and that we were allowed to hear. I was 15. I had been a press feeder in a stamping mill on Hive Rostvik, which means standing at the mouth of an industrial press feeding sheet metal into it, a panel every few seconds, for as long as the shift runs. It is not skilled labor, and it requires no training. It requires that you do not put your hands where the press comes down, and that you do not fall asleep, and that you keep doing it until the shift register runs out, or the press solves the problem for you. I had been doing it a couple of years when my shift supervisor, a man named Orenwald, lost most of a hand to a punch die that had been running misaligned for a week. I did not report the malfunction because Orenwald told me not to. When the safety audit came through, the auditor found the maintenance log empty going back weeks, matched it to the injury report, and charged me with failure to file a mandated workplace hazard notification, which under Rostvik Hive Industrial Code carries a designation of administrative sabotage. The auditor did not charge Orenwald because Orenwald was the shift supervisor, and the auditor reported to the same production overseer he did. And charging a supervisor means somebody has to explain why his supervision failed. So they charged me. Nobody has to explain a press feeder. The tribunal took less time than a quarter cycle of panels. I watched the chronometer above the magistrate's head and worked that out while it was happening, and thought that the panel run would outlast whatever I had just been sentenced to. I was wrong about that. Kelvadden is a Category Sigma penal world in the trailing reaches of subsector Hallengard, too toxic to colonize, too mineral-rich to waste, too far from anything for anyone with rank to care what happens on it. The atmosphere kills you inside an hour unfiltered. The surface is a flat chemical plane of granite and slag out to a horizon that looks like somebody scraped the skin off a wound and forgot to bandage it. No weather, no wildlife, no seasons. The sky is the color of old parchment, permanently, and the light through it makes healthy men look sick and sick men look dead. The survey team that came out here generations ago recommended it for penal designation on the grounds that the environment presents a natural deterrent to unauthorized departure. That is the only joke Kelvadden has ever produced, and it was made by a man who never set foot on the surface. They processed us in a building called the intake shed, which is the size of a small manufactorum and has exactly the same emotional warmth. You walk in through a set of blast doors with your transit restraints still on. You walk down a corridor lined with yellow lumen strips that buzz at a frequency designed, I am fairly certain, by someone who hated human beings. You stop at a counter. A man behind the counter, an inmate on permanent administrative detail, enters your name, your world, your offense, your sentence, and your description into a cogitator older than anyone alive on this planet. He does not look at you. The only variation in his day is when the machine jams, which is often, and he restarts it by hitting the casing with his palm in a pattern he has never written down, because knowing that pattern is the reason they have not replaced him. He stamps a chit and slides it across, and you take it to the next station, where they take everything you own. Everything. Your clothes, your shoes, your belongings, whatever you managed to keep through transit, whatever you hid in your mouth, or between your fingers, or in any other cavity that a transit guard was too bored to check. It goes into a bin, and the bin goes into a storage room, and the storage room is emptied once a year and burned, because nobody has ever left Kelvadden with enough warning to collect anything. Then they shave you. Head, face, arms, everything, with a chemical solution that burns the hair off rather than cutting it, because razors are a controlled item and nobody hands a razor to a room of freshly arrived convicts. It feels like somebody setting fire to every pore on your body and pouring acid into the ashes. The man applying it uses a mop, the way you would wax a floor, and he tells you to stand still, because if it gets in your eyes, you are blind for a week, and the medical block does not waste supplies on intake injuries. I was 15. I did not stand still. I could not see properly out of the left eye for days, and nobody offered me anything, because 64782 had a work assignment starting before the next bell, and the medical block had a queue of men injured doing things that produced output. After the shaving, they brand you. A 6-digit number burned into the back of your left hand with an iron that has been heated in a small furnace in the corner of the room. The man who brands does not look at your face. He takes your hand, he turns it over, he presses the iron down, he holds it for a count of 3, and he lifts it. There is a smell. I will not describe the smell. You know what burned skin smells like, or you do not. And if you do not, I am not going to be the one to educate you. The iron is 6 digits, each a separate piece of metal slotted into a frame, and the man doing it rearranges them for every inmate, and sometimes he sets one backwards, and then somebody walks around for the rest of his life with a number that reads wrong from every angle. Nobody corrects it. The number is in the system. The system does not care what the hand says. They gave me a uniform, gray coveralls made from a fabric that feels woven from sand and resentment, boots I was swimming in because the quartermaster issues off a single pile and you take what is on top and stuff rags in the toes. A rebreather for surface work which filters the outside atmosphere down to something that damages your lungs slowly instead of killing you quickly. The filters are supposed to be replaced on a schedule. They are replaced when they clog so badly you cannot draw through them, which takes a good deal longer than the schedule allows for, and by then you are breathing a fair percentage of the raw atmosphere anyway. You do not need the surface for it in the end. The air inside the dome is the air that comes off the crushers, and after long enough my lungs sound like a bag of gravel when I breathe in too deeply. The medical station has a name for the condition. It is long, and I have never got it right. The orderly who checks me once a quarter writes the word stable in my file and moves on, because stable is the word you write when a man is dying in a way that does not interfere with his work assignment. They assigned me to Section 7 of the primary processing block, which at the time fell under a prefect named Hallmuth, the senior Arbites officer on the colony, who had been on Kelvadden a decade and who spent his shifts in the processing block rather than in his office, because the processing block is where the output is decided, and who ran the place the way I imagine a man might run a slaughterhouse if the slaughterhouse occasionally tried to kill him back. Hallmuth was not cruel the way stories about prisons lead you to expect. What Hallmuth did was nothing. If a man collapsed on the line, nothing. If a fight broke out in the dormitory, nothing. If the quota was missed and the shift ran on past the bell, he locked the exit doors and sat in his station and waited, and the men kept working because the alternative was standing in a locked room with the man who controlled the air filtration. He had, on more than one documented occasion, turned the air down for a section that refused quota. Not off. Just down, until people were short of breath, and then until the first man fainted and somebody decided the quota was achievable after all. Hallmuth never raised his voice. He had the switch. That was my first day. Burns on my scalp, a brand weeping on my hand, one eye swollen half shut, and a man I had never met with his hand on the air I was breathing. I was 15 years old, and I was a component. Nobody asks a component how it feels about the machine. The first man I saw killed on Kelvadden was a man named Gesser, and the reason I remember his name is that he died over a blanket. Not a good blanket. Not a blanket with any particular value. A standard issue colony blanket, gray synthetic weave, thin enough to read through if you held it up to a lumen strip. And Gesser had 2 of them, because the man in the bunk below his had died of a chest infection during the night, and Gesser had taken the dead man's blanket, before the body was even cold. A man called Horab, who had been on Kelvadden for 9 years at that point, and who controlled the distribution of everything that was not officially distributed in Section 7, told Gesser to hand the blanket over. Gesser refused. Horab hit him in the throat with a length of pipe that he kept in his coverall leg, and Gesser went down making a sound like air escaping from a cracked seal, and Horab took the blanket and walked away, and Gesser lay on the dormitory floor until the morning shift bell sounded and the body detail came through and carried him out on a stretcher that was really just a sheet of deck plating with rope handles. Nobody reported it. There was nothing to report. The system registered Gesser's death as respiratory failure, which was technically accurate, because having your trachea collapsed by a length of pipe is a form of respiratory failure if you look at it from the right angle, and the inmate clerk who filed the death report looked at everything from the right angle because Horab was the one who decided which angle you looked from. I learned 3 things in my first week. The first is that Kelvadden has 2 governments. The official one is the governor-warden and his arbiters and overseers who hold the gates, the landing field, the shutters, and the turrets. The actual one is the network of men like Horab who control everything that matters inside the wire. Blankets, food portions, work assignments, the medical queue, filters that have not already been used past their threshold. The official government sets the quotas and counts the output. The actual government decides who lives well enough to meet them. The arbiters staff here has never been more than a couple of hundred, and a couple of hundred men cannot manage 30,000 without intermediaries. So the price of the arrangement is that sometimes a man dies over a blanket, and the report says respiratory failure. The second thing I learned is that there are 3 ways to survive on Kelvadden, and only 3. You can be strong, which means you are useful to men like Horab as an enforcer, and you will live until someone stronger arrives and replaces you. The man doing that job when I arrived was Vetch, the largest human being I had ever stood near, and for the better part of a year, he was the answer to every question about who decides anything in the dormitory. He took a portion off my tray twice a week, and I let him. Because everybody did. In the 11th month, a transport brought in a man whose tribunal had classified what he did as multiple homicide by industrial means. Intake put him on the separation tables because that was where the shortfall was that week, and the separation tables are where the screens are, and nobody in that decision was thinking about anything but the shortfall. He watched Vetch for the better part of a fortnight, and then he opened Vetch's throat with a screen he had spent those evenings grinding against a wall. In the washroom, in front of 30 of us. Nobody moved. Then he stood in Vetch's place in the ration queue to see whether anybody would object to that either. Nobody did. The body detail came in the morning. You can be invisible, which works until the block needs a body for a detail nobody wants, at which point invisibility is the same as volunteering. Or you can be useful in a way nobody else is, which is what I chose, out of the absence of alternatives. I was 15 and light enough that a strong wind would have been an argument, and I could not have fought my way out of a storage crate. What I could do was watch a press all shift without falling asleep. Inside my first month, I noticed that the number 4 feed conveyor jammed on a fixed interval because the bearing housing was cracked and the belt tracked sideways under load. And I told the line overseer, a man named Merken, and Merken looked at me the way you look at a piece of equipment that has just done something unexpected and possibly valuable. Merken was in his 40s, which on Kelvadden made him ancient. He had been on the colony 17 years, convicted of murdering an administratum tithe assessor on his home world, and he had survived that long by being the only man in Section 7 who understood how the primary crusher worked, not how to operate it. Anyone could operate it, how it worked. The difference is the same as the difference between a man who drives a vehicle and a man who can tell you why the vehicle is making that noise, and on a penal colony where replacement parts arrive once a year on a supply barge. And the machine cult will not certify a conveyor because a conveyor is not part of the sanctified chain. The man who can tell you why the crusher is making that noise is the man who decides whether production runs today or does not. And production is the only thing the governor-warden cares about, because the governor-warden's continued posting depends on meeting the extraction quota the administratum set centuries ago, and has never revised. Merken did not take me under his protection out of kindness. Merken had no kindness. What Merken had was a cracked bearing housing on the number 4 conveyor, and a 15-year-old boy who had spotted it without being told to look, and that was close enough to kindness for the purposes of staying alive. He taught me the machines. The first lesson was on my 9th day when he put my hand flat on the primary crusher housing while it was running and held it there. Not hard. He just did not let go. He kept it there for a long time, and then he moved it a hand's width along and held it there, and then he took his hand off mine and waited. The second place was warmer. He said nothing at all. I said the bearing, and he grunted and walked off. And that was the whole of it, and I have started every shift since by putting my palm on that housing, including the shifts on a world where the thing I put my hand on was a chimera hull and there was no bearing in it to feel. He taught me the rest the same way. Not formally, not the way a guild would teach an apprentice, with liturgies and blessings and the mechanicus's rites of maintenance. He taught me the way a man teaches a dog, by pointing at things and rewarding the right answer, with the absence of punishment. The crusher makes aggregate. The separation tables pull the concentrate. The furnace makes ingots. The ingots go on pallets. The pallets go on lifters. The lifters go to the landing field. A bulk freighter comes on a cycle of about 6 weeks and takes the ingots away, and in return the freighter leaves supplies, and the supplies are never enough, and the gap between what the freighter brings and what the colony needs is the space in which men like Horab build their kingdoms. The convict transports run on their own schedule, and it is a busier one. They have to be. 30,000 men on this planet, and something close to a third of any intake gone inside the first year, and the ones who get past the first year keep dying afterwards at a slower and more dignified rate. And all of that has to be made up out of hulls, because nothing is born here. 2 or 3 transports arrive for every freighter that leaves. Bodies come in on a shorter cycle than ore goes out. That is what this planet is, stated as a schedule, and it is not concealed anywhere. It is chalked on the arrival board at the landing field, in and out, where anybody on a loading detail can stand and read it. No survey team ever needed to set foot on the surface to establish what this place does. Merken gave me that chain over a few months in fragments at the machines, and none of it was offered as instruction. He gave it to me because he wanted a replacement standing at the end of it, because he had been coughing a long while and could see the trajectory of his own lungs, and he wanted someone who would be standing at the primary crusher on the day he could not stand there any longer. Because if the crusher stopped, Section 7's output dropped, and if Section 7's output dropped, the governor-warden started asking questions, and questions from the governor-warden had a way of becoming answers that nobody enjoyed. Kelvadden runs on a small number of fixed quantities, and none of them are the ones on administratum forms. The shift is 14 hours. The ration is processed nutrient paste twice a day. eaten with your fingers out of a metal tray, because utensils are a controlled item. The calorie count is set to keep a man capable of physical labor and incapable of anything beyond it. It is deliberately bland, or else it is made on the cheapest available contract by a supplier who has never had a shipment refused. Either way, it tastes the same. The water ration is drawn from a communal tap at the end of each dormitory corridor, and the water tastes the way the whole colony tastes because it comes from the same filtration system that processes the runoff from the extraction operations, and no amount of filtration entirely removes the greenite particulate, and the inside of my teeth is the color of old bone. 67 men from my intake transport were dead within the first year. That figure is not mine. It is the section strength return, which is read out at the start of every quarter to whoever is standing near the board, and which I was standing near because the board is bolted to the wall beside the primary crusher. Merken made me listen to it. "Everything here has a rate," he said. "Machines have a rate. Men have a rate. Learn the rate, and you know where the failure is going to be. And if you know where it is going to be, you can arrange to be standing somewhere else." He said it while stripping a bearing, without looking up, in the voice of somebody reading out a part number. Causes in order of frequency. Industrial accidents on the line. Respiratory disease. Violence between inmates, usually over resources, once over a place in the medical queue. Infections from untreated injuries, because 30,000 men are served by a pair of orderlies, and one medici officer struck off the rolls for reasons nobody ever explained, who treats broken bones and chemical burns with the same short list of supplies: a coagulant spray, an antiseptic that stings worse than the injury, and a bottle of what he calls general analgesic, and what is a veterinary sedative at half strength. 4. Died of exposure on surface details in masks logged as functional and not. 2. By their own hand. That happens here and it is not discussed. 3 of causes the medical block recorded as unknown, which here means the cause was known, and writing it down would have required somebody to investigate, and investigations cost time, and time costs output, and output is the only currency that the governor-warden spends. I survived because I was useful. The first year because Merken needed somebody to watch the conveyor and spot a tracking fault before it became a 6-hour jam. The second because I learned to clean the separation screens with a wire brush and a solvent that took the skin off my fingertips and grew it back scarred, twice a shift without being told. A clean screen runs better, and that margin is quota, and quota is whether the shift runs over, and a shift that runs over is whether you sleep. A man who has not slept stops watching the belt, and a man who stops watching the belt puts his hand where the belt meets the roller drum, and then he is short a finger or two. The press I fed on Rostvik was not the only machine in the Imperium that solves inattention by taking pieces of you. Nobody on Kelvadden is innocent. That is not a moral statement. It is an administrative one. The system does not distinguish between the man who stole bread and the man who murdered a household in their sleep, and after a few years, neither does anyone else. The bread thief learns to fight or dies. The murderer learns to take orders from whoever holds the water tap or dies. Both eat the same paste and cough the same cough. The paperwork that sent them here is in a storage room on a world they will never see again, being eaten by mold, and the man who wrote it is dead, and his replacement has never heard of Kelvadden. Kelvadden exists to mine and process grinite ore. Grinite is a dense calcareous mineral that the Mechanicus uses in the manufacture of hull plating for bulk transports and naval auxiliaries. It is not rare. It is not valuable in the way that adamantium or auramite is valuable. It is valuable in the way that sand is valuable if you need a lot of sand, and nobody wants to go where the sand is. That is Kelvadden. I have held a finished ingot exactly once in my first year, before Horab had any use for me and before there was any reason to keep my name off the roster. About the size of a boot, heavier than it looks, the color of a bad tooth, with a Mechanicus stamp pressed into the face of it, and nothing else on it anywhere. No origin mark, no facility code. Nothing on it said Kelvadden, and nothing on it said what it cost. 30,000 men and a stamp the size of a thumbnail. The Mechanicus needs granite in quantity, and nobody wants to go where the granite is, so the Imperium did what it does with unpleasant places and expendable people. It built a colony on top of the deposit and stamped the paperwork that turns convicts into a labor force, and a labor force into a line on a requisition. The mining is done in shafts, sunk several hundred meters into the granite bed. The air down there is thick with dust even through a rebreather. The temperature rises with depth, and at the bottom the men drink their whole water ration early and spend the rest of the shift dehydrated. To a degree, the medical block would call dangerous if anybody from the medical block had ever been down a shaft, which nobody has. The miners use hand tools. Picks, wedges, hammers, pry bars. In my 14th year, the roof came down in Shaft 9 on a face crew of 19. They got 4 out. The other 15 were behind several meters of collapsed granite, and they were alive because the men on the surface could hear them through the rock for the better part of 2 days. The colony did not dig. A recovery would have taken a fortnight of the shaft's full crew and produced no tonnage, and Shaft 9 was already behind, and the governor-warden of the day signed an assessment stating that the men were unlikely to survive a fortnight in any case, which was true, and which was also the sort of thing that becomes true because somebody has written it down. They sank a fresh face further along the seam and left them in there. The tapping went on into the 3rd day. Men worked the new face with that going on behind the rock beside them, and then it stopped, and they kept working, because the shift does not end when the tapping does. Each shaft has a single pneumatic drill, and it works about half the time, and when it does not, the men use their hands, because the quota does not adjust for equipment failure, and the shift does not end until the quota is met. I have seen men come up off a full shift on a pick, unable to close their fingers around anything, hands locked in the shape of the handle, and the orderly gives them the sedative and tells them to sleep it off, and they are back down before the next bell, because the man who does not report is the man who is volunteered for surface detail, which is worse. Surface detail is punishment, and mostly the unofficial kind, the kind Horab and men like him administer. If you owe a debt you cannot pay, or you have offended somebody whose offense carries weight, or a clerk has been told to add your name, you get surface detail. It means going outside the dome in a rebreather for a full shift on the fence, or clearing slag from the furnace vents, or loading the cargo lifters. The work is not the punishment. The air is. Even with a functioning rebreather, a full shift on the surface puts enough granite particulate into your lungs to shorten your life by a measurable amount, and the men who work surface detail regularly develop the cough within a year instead of the usual 5 or 6, and the men who work it for extended periods stop developing anything at all because they are dead. The official record says that surface detail is a standard work assignment with no punitive designation. The official record says many things. I never worked the shafts. That was Merken's doing, and after he died it was my own. Because by then I was the only man in Section 7 who understood the primary crusher, and the primary crusher is where the chain starts. Merken died in my 4th year. It was a 3rd shift, not long before the bell. He was standing at the primary crusher control panel, The way he stood every shift, a hand on the feed regulator and a hand on the guardrail. And he coughed. He had been coughing for months, but this was a different sound, wet and deep and final, and he went down on a knee and then on both, and then flat on the deck, plating with his hands around his own throat, like he was trying to open a valve that had seized. I was a few paces away, checking the separation table alignment, and the first thing I did was not run to him. The first thing I did was check the crusher feed. The hopper was a quarter full, the auger was running, the rate was nominal. The line would run a good while, yet before it needed attention. I worked all of that out before I crossed to the man who had kept me alive for 4 years. Merken would have checked the feed first. He would have expected me to. Merken died on the deck, plating with granite dust on his face and his eyes open, and I knelt beside him for exactly as long as it took the body detail to arrive, which was the better part of an hour, and then I stood up and ran the crusher for the rest of the shift. Nobody told me to. The man who knew that machine was on a stretcher, and the man who knew it now was me. And I was the only person in the building who knew that. It has kept me alive for 39 years. This is why I have never taught anybody everything I know. The senior staff are arbites secondments, assigned to penal duty either because they asked for it, which nobody does, or because they did something at a previous posting that made their superiors want them somewhere far away and hard to come back from. They run the administrative block, the armory, the perimeter systems, and the formal disciplinary apparatus. They carry shock mauls and sidearms, wear carapace, walk in pairs, do not fraternize with inmates or with each other, and live behind blast doors that are never opened from our side. The senior arbites officer on Kelvadden holds the rank of prefect and reports directly to the governor-warden. I have seen a run of prefects come and go, and they have ranged from the professionally indifferent to the actively sadistic. And the difference between the two, from my perspective, has been negligible, because the machinery of the colony operates the same way, regardless of who is sitting in the prefect's chair. Below them are the overseers, seconded planetary defense force troops from whatever world is contracted to supply Kelvadden's security detail, and as a category they are worse than the arbites in every measurable way. The arbites at least have training and a standard, however poorly applied. The overseers drew the worst assignment their regiment could offer, resent every minute of it, and take that out on the only people below them, which is us. An overseer on Kelvadden carries a lascarbine, a shock baton, and the authority to administer what the regulations call corrective physical discipline, which means they can beat you for any reason or no reason, and the only oversight is a report that they file themselves. And in all the years I spent under Prefect Hallmuth's supervision, I never once saw an overseer's report questioned by anyone. A man named Sedic, who had arrived a couple of years before I did, and who worked the separation tables in my section, was beaten so badly by a pair of overseers after a shift dispute that he lost the use of his left arm. The report said he had fallen down a maintenance stairwell. Sedic could not write a counter-report. Counter-reports are filed through the administrative block, and the arbites do not accept reports from inmates about overseers, because accepting one means acknowledging in writing that the oversight system has failed and that acknowledgement travels. And below the overseers is the automated system, which in my professional opinion as a man who has maintained machinery his whole life is the most honest part of this colony. The perimeter is ringed with turret emplacements, twin-linked heavy stubbers on targeting cogitators that track movement in a 90-degree arc and fire on anything crossing the outer fence without an authorized transponder. They do not have opinions or bad days. They fire when the parameters are met, and I have never seen one make an error, which is more than I can say for anybody else here. Men have been killed by the perimeter turrets in my time, and I could give you the number. 14 of them were attempting to escape, which on Kelvadden is a theoretical exercise rather than a practical one, because even if you get past the turrets, you are standing on a toxic chemical plane with no transport, no shelter, no water, and no destination. And the farthest anyone has ever made it is a few kilometers before the atmosphere finished what the turrets started. The other two were killed by a guard who adjusted the targeting arc on a turret to cover a section of the exercise yard, and then told a man he disliked to walk to the far end of it. The turret performed exactly as designed. The guard was transferred to another facility. The man was buried in the granite slag pit along with every other man who has ever died on Kelvadden, because there is no cemetery on a penal world. There is a pit. And the pit does not fill up because the slag dissolves organic matter inside a couple of years, and by then there is nothing left that anyone would recognize as a person, and the administrative record says transferred to permanent holding, which is the Kelvadden euphemism for dead. And nobody has ever asked what permanent holding looks like because everybody already knows. I should explain how I have seen the inside of the administrative block because the blast doors are never opened from the inmate side. The block has machines in it, cogitator cooling, air handling, a water recirculator, a power trunk that feeds the terminals and the door actuators. All of it installed generations ago by people who are dead and maintained since by whoever the colony could find, and the colony cannot find anybody because the arbiters do not repair equipment, and the overseers do not repair equipment, and the Mechanicus Enclave will not touch it. There is a Mechanicus Enclave on Kelvadden, a handful of adepts and some servitors quartered beside the smelting furnace, and their function is to bless the furnace, certify ingot purity, and stamp the manifests, because the machine cult does not accept material it has not certified. They have been here longer than the penal designation. They do not speak to inmates, and they speak to the governor-warden through a monthly liaison protocol, and they have never accepted a work request concerning any machine outside the sanctified chain, because air handling in an administrative building is not a machine to them. It is furniture. So when the cooling fails, which it does about twice a year, an arbiters officer comes to Section 7 and collects me. The tools do not go through with me. At the inner door there is a board with painted outlines, one per item, and an overseer lays every tool into its shape and counts them out loud, and hands them back one at a time, and each goes back on the board before the next leaves it. When the job is done, he counts again. If the count is short, the door does not open, and it does not open for anybody, including him. I once watched a man spend the better part of a shift on his knees under a cogitator housing after a wedge that had gone down a cable trunk, 3 of us standing over him, and nobody suggested leaving it. They are not counting weapons. A hammer is a hammer, whether it is on a board or in a shaft, and every man here works within reach of something that would open a skull. They are counting the transaction. A tool that goes in and does not come out has to be written down, and a thing written down is a line somebody at the subsector capital might one day ask about. Nobody has ever searched what I carry out behind my eyes. I have done that walk more times than I could put a figure to, and not once has anyone asked what I read in there. There is no outline on the board for that. Everything here has a price, and the currency is favors. No money, no scrip, no token. If you do something for a man he owes you, the debt is held in the memory of the section, and a man who does not pay cannot buy. And a man who cannot buy is breathing through a filter, 100 hours past replacement, and sleeping under the vent that blows dust on his face all night. My place in it was settled in my second year, when the feed conveyor in Section 7 seized for the third time in a week, and Hallmuth informed Horab that if the section missed quota again, the entire dormitory block would go on half rations until the deficit was recovered. Horab came to me. He did not ask. He stood there with his arms folded and looked at me, and I told him the drive chain was short a couple of links because somebody had cut a section off to use as a weapon, and that it tracked sideways under tension, and that I could shorten it a link and move the tensioner bracket forward in about an hour and a half with a pry bar and a hammer. Horab said nothing. An hour and a half later, the conveyor was turning, and his man brought me a rebreather filter, unused, still in Munitorum packaging, worth more than anything I had ever owned here. From that day, I was on Horab's maintenance list, and in return I got filters, ration supplements, and the understanding that my name would not appear on the surface roster. The official system knows all of this, and has made its peace with it, because the alternative is supplying the colony properly, and that would cost more than the Greenite is worth. The acceptable cost is men, and men are the one thing the Imperium has never run short of. 3 governors warden have served in my time. The first was Olmund Thuld, appointed before I arrived, who ran the colony the way a man runs equipment he has been told to maintain but not improve. He kept it running, met the quota, filed the reports, and asked nothing about what happened between one report and the next. He understood, the way only a career administratum functionary can, that the purpose of his post was not to make the place better or worse, but to make it invisible, because an invisible colony is one nobody inspects, and a colony nobody inspects is one where the governor-warden keeps his posting. He served 2 decades and more, and the only decision I know him to have originated rather than countersigned was the one that left 15 men behind 6 meters of rock in Shaft 9. Everything else went through him the way water goes through a pipe. He died in his quarters at 73, and the colony did not notice for 2 days, because he had not left them in a week, and nobody found that unusual, and the place ran itself, and his contribution had been a signature on the quarterly output report. The second governor-warden was a woman named Eselde Brano, and she was the worst thing that ever happened to Kelvadden, and I have thought about the atmosphere, and I am standing by that. Brano arrived within the week of Thuld's body going off-world, which tells you everything you need to know about the Administratum's replacement pipeline. The successor was already in transit before the predecessor was confirmed dead, because the Administratum does not wait for vacancies. It anticipates them, and a 73-year-old man running a penal colony in a toxic environment is a vacancy waiting to happen, and the paperwork had been filed accordingly. Brano had run a labor camp on a mining world in Segmentum Tempestus, and had been sent here because that facility beat its quota year on year, which the Administratum read as exceptional management, and which was actually a woman killing her inmates twice as fast as projection, and replacing them out of a conscription pipeline she had built by falsifying offense reports in the settlements around her. I learned that years later. What I knew at the time was that she walked the processing block on her second day with a data slate and a look I recognized from Orenwald on Rostvik, the look of somebody who sees a machine running under capacity and wants to know why. Brano raised the quotas. She raised them by 1/3 across all sections in her first month, which meant that the standard shift was no longer long enough to meet the daily target, so the shifts were extended and then extended again, and the gap between the end of one and the beginning of the next shrank until it was not long enough to sleep in, and the men on the line began to break at a rate that I could track on the production board the way I tracked conveyor faults. 3 men died in the first week of the new quota. 2 from exhaustion, one from a processing accident caused by exhaustion. The medical block reported them as cardiac failure, respiratory failure, and industrial mishap. Nobody falsified those entries. A heart that stops in the 18th hour has stopped, and a man who goes into a roller because he has not slept has gone into a roller, and every word on all of them was true. The form simply has no field for the 18th hour. There is nowhere on it to write down what the hours were, so the hours are not part of the record. And a cause of death on Kelvadden is whatever remains after you subtract everything the form cannot hold. The death rate across the colony rose by more than half in her first quarter. The output rose by roughly a fifth. Brano filed both figures in the same report, and the administratum, reading only the second one, sent a commendation. It was Brano who provoked the only riot in my time on Kelvadden. I was not in it. I have it from 4 men who were, over a good many years, and from the file, and the file and the 4 men do not describe the same event. The riot started in Section 12, which was a shaft section on the far side of the colony from my own, and it started because the Section 12 water tap had been shut off for 18 hours as a collective punishment for a missed quota. 18 hours without water in a section where the shafts run hot enough to empty a man. A man named Palkin, who was the Section 12 equivalent of what Horab was in Section 7, meaning the man who actually controlled the section, went to the administrative block and requested that the water be restored. He made this request through proper channels, which on Kelvadden means he walked to the blast doors and spoke to the Arbitesse guard on duty through the intercom, and the Arbitesse guard told him to wait, and he waited most of the morning, and then the intercom informed him that the water restriction would remain in effect until the quota deficit was made up, and the deficit was tonnage the section could not produce without water, and the intercom was not interested in that observation. Palkin went back to Section 12 and told his people what the intercom had said, and then about 200 men walked out of the shafts and sat down on the floor of the main corridor and refused to work, which is not a protest on a penal colony. It is a death sentence with a time delay because the regulations permit the use of lethal force against inmates engaged in collective refusal of a work order, and the regulations do not require a warning. What happened next is the part the file records as a disturbance resolved by perimeter action. The file is not wrong. It is also not the truth. Brano did not send overseers into that corridor. 200 men in a confined space against a dozen men with shock batons is a fight, and a fight has an outcome that nobody can predict, and Brano did not deal in outcomes she could not predict. What she did was order a general muster. A muster is routine. A muster happens twice a month for head count, and it happens in the exercise yard, and the announcement came over the section vox in the ordinary phrasing that every man on the colony has obeyed 100 times, and the men in the corridor stood up and walked out into the yard, because a muster is not a work order, and refusing a work order was the only thing they had agreed among themselves to do. They formed up in rows. Somebody had brought water out with them and was handing it along the line. Then the turrets moved. The yard sits inside the perimeter arc on the northern face, and the traverse limits on the emplacements covering that side are adjustable from the administrative block, and the man who adjusted them was the Arbitesse prefect, whose name was Durnham, and who had stood beside Brano through the whole of the 18 hours and had not spoken once that anybody heard, and the Vox said that the men in the yard had 60 seconds to return to their workstations. 43 of them ran for the shaft head. The rest stayed where they were, in rows in a yard, holding water, because they had been standing in a muster formation for some minutes by then, and a man in a muster formation has been trained by a lifetime of head counts not to break it, and because the ones who understood what the Traverse motors meant were the ones who had been on Kelvadden longest and were furthest from the door. The guns opened at the 61-second mark. The timer had been set before the announcement was made, and whoever set it allowed exactly a second of grace, which is either the most generous or the most contemptuous gesture I have ever encountered, and I have never been able to decide which. The regulation permits lethal force against inmates engaged in collective refusal of a work order. Those men were not refusing. They had come out of that corridor and formed up in rows because they were told to muster, and they were shot in the middle of obeying. But a refusal here does not end when the men go back to work. It ends when somebody files that it has ended, and nobody filed it. The Section 12 refusal was opened when they sat down and never closed. So at the moment the guns opened, those men were, on the only paper where any of this exists, still refusing. 112 men died. 17 more died of injuries in the following hours, because the medical block was not equipped to treat that volume of casualties, and the orderlies triaged by work capacity, treating the men who could return to the shaft first, and leaving the ones who could not on the ground where they had fallen. The water was turned back on after the yard was cleared. Passen was one of the 43 who ran. In the dormitories, he has since become a man who stood in the front rank and went down facing the guns. He heard the Traverse motors and understood them before anybody else out there, because understanding things like that was why he ran that section, and he went for the shaft head and made it. Nothing was done to him, not questioned, not moved, not put on any roster. To discipline Passen, somebody would first have had to write down that a named inmate assembled 200 men and led them out of the shafts, and the moment that sentence exists on paper, it is not a disturbance anymore. It is an insurrection on a penal world, and the subsector capital sends somebody to look at those. The quarterly report listed the deaths under operational security incident, and the output figures for that quarter showed a dip Brano attributed to equipment maintenance, because acknowledging that she had killed 112 men over a water tap would have required somebody to ask why the tap was off, and nobody wanted to ask that. So Passen went back to work. He ran Section 12 for years after that, with the 70-odd who were left, and the men moved in to stand where the dead had stood, and by the end, nobody in there mentioned the yard. He died of the lungs like everybody else. All of that I got afterwards. What I had at the time was the sound. It carries through the walls, a flat hammering with no shape to it, and it went on for a length of time I could not have put a number to, and I stayed where I was, which is next to the primary crusher, which is where I stay whenever something happens that I do not understand. Because the primary crusher is my value, and my value is my life, and a man who leaves his value behind to go and look at someone else's catastrophe is a man who has confused curiosity with survival. Merken taught me that. Or rather, Merken taught me the principle and the practice taught me the application. Release is the thing every man here talks about, and nobody here understands. And the gap between the talking and the understanding is the worst thing on this planet. I am including the turrets and the water tap and the slag pit in that. Release is the formal process by which an inmate who has finished his sentence comes off the rolls and goes back to civilian status. It is in the regulations. It is in the sentencing documents. Most of the men here have a fixed term, and every one of them carries a date in his head, and that date is the only thing on this planet with a future attached to it. I served a 12-year sentence. Administrative sabotage, juvenile classification, reduced by the automatic mitigation that applies to offenders under the age of 16. 12 years. I did not have to keep track of them, because the colony keeps track for you. Every man's file carries his sentence expiry, and the expiry is printed on the work chit that comes out of the section terminal at the start of each quarter, in the bottom corner, in the same faded ink as everything else. And for 12 years I read that corner every quarter and watched the same date sit there, getting no closer and no further away, because a date does not move. Only you do. When the quarter came around and the date on the chit was behind me instead of in front of me, I went to the administrative block and stood at the intercom and said that my sentence had expired. The Arbites guard on the other side of the intercom checked the system and confirmed that 64782 had indeed reached the end of his designated sentence period. He then informed me that release processing was handled on a quarterly schedule, and the next processing date was a quarter away, and I should return to my work assignment and present myself at the administrative block on the specified date. I returned to my work assignment. I worked the quarter. I presented myself at the administrative block on the specified date. And the Arbites clerk at the processing desk, a man I had never seen before and would never see again, told me that release was not the same as discharge, and that release meant that my sentence was complete, but my departure was contingent on available transport. And available transport was the next outbound convict hauler with berth space, and the next outbound convict hauler was not scheduled for months yet, and in the meantime I was to continue my work assignment under the classification of released inmate, which carried the same obligations as serving inmate, with the exception that my file now carried a notation indicating completion of sentence. I worked for 4 more months. The convict hauler arrived. I was not on the departure manifest. I went back to the administrative block, and the clerk, a man named Bletton, who had been an inmate himself before they put him behind that desk, told me that the hauler had arrived at capacity and there were no empty berths, and the next scheduled transport was half a year out. Bletton did not look at me when he said it. He was already looking at the next chit in his stack. I would come to know Bletton well over the next several years, because every time I checked the queue, it was Bletton behind the terminal, and every time Bletton gave me the same answer in the same tone, and every time Bletton was already looking at the next chit before I had finished turning away, and I thought at the time that he was simply efficient, that he was a man who processed information the way the Crusher processed ore, without opinion or hesitation, and I was right about that, but I was wrong about what he was processing. I worked for 6 more months. The next transport arrived. I was not on the departure manifest. The clerk told me that released inmates were assigned to outbound transport on a priority basis determined by sentence category, and that administrative sabotage was a Category 3 offense, and Category 3 offenses ranked below Category 1 and 2 offenses on the departure priority list, and there were 418 men with Category 1 and 2 offenses ahead of me. I asked how long the queue was. The clerk looked at his cogitator screen for a long time, and then said he could not provide that information because the system did not calculate estimated wait time for Category 3 offenses. I went back to the processing line. I worked. I waited. I checked every quarter. Every quarter the answer was the same. Not this transport, not this transport, not this transport. After a few years, I stopped checking every quarter and started checking every year. Then I stopped checking every year. Then I stopped checking. I was 27, 12 years a serving inmate, and 7 a released one. And the difference between the two was a notation in a file nobody had ever read. Release was not a door. Release was a word, and the word existed to give men something to work towards. And when the working reached the end of it, the word was replaced by another word with no door behind it either. Nobody had lied. Nobody had promised anything. The regulations were followed to the letter, and the letter says nothing about leaving. There was a man in Section 4 called Tretoven who had been here longer than anybody and was the nearest thing this place had to a landmark. New arrivals were walked down in their first month by somebody who thought it was funny and shown an old man tightening clamps on a separation frame who had been doing it since before their fathers were born. He knew he was being shown and did not mind. He would put down the wrench and ask what world you had come off, and then tell you one true thing about it, because he had been here long enough to have met somebody from everywhere, and he collected what they told him. He gave me the name of the street my stamping mill stood on. I had not told him the name of the mill. He had it from a man who died years before I ever landed. I have since watched 41 men reach the end of their sentences. Everyone went the same way. The quarterly schedule, the transport with no berths, the queue that does not move. Some kept checking for years, some stopped after months. A few tried to force it, and forcing it here means raising your voice at an intercom wired to a room of armed arbiters behind a blast door, and the intercom has a button that summons the overseers, and after the shock batons the man is back on the line with a conduct infraction, fresh bruises, and the same word in his file. Released. It was built to mean nothing because the colony needs bodies, and bodies have numbers, and numbers do not expire. In my 19th year on Kelvadden, 4 years after I had stopped checking the release queue, the Munitorum came for bodies. I use that word deliberately. They did not come for soldiers. They did not come for volunteers. They came for bodies in the same way that the freighter comes for ingots, on a schedule with a manifest and with a cargo capacity that needed filling. The transport was a converted troop carrier called the Harsh Amendment. It came in on a supply day and sat on the landing field alongside the bulk freighter, and nobody told us for hours why there was a second ship. Then the Vox broadcast one announcement across the whole colony. All inmates with a physical capability rating of C4 or above to report to the landing field for processing. C4 or above means anyone who can stand upright unassisted and has 2 working arms, which here excludes the seriously injured and the actively dying. I had 2 working arms. I reported because the announcement did not contain the word voluntary, and here the absence of that word is the same as the presence of the word mandatory. They lined us up on the landing field in rows of 50. 1,500 men, give or take, standing in rebreathers on the granite plain in the yellowish light. Munitorum clerks walked the rows with data slates, checking numbers against fields, marking some men with a yellow stripe on the shoulder of their coveralls, and passing others by. The selection criteria were not explained. I later worked out that they were selecting by age and sentence category. Younger men with violent offense classifications went first, then younger men with non-violent classifications, then men under 50, and so on. And I was 34, and my classification was administrative sabotage, which is non-violent, and I got the yellow stripe. And the man next to me, who was 52 and had a respiratory rating that the medical block had listed as functional, did not get the stripe. And the man on my other side, who was 26 and had murdered his foreman with a hydraulic press, got the stripe and laughed about it. And I have thought about that laugh more than about anything else that happened on the landing field that day. They took 600 of us. 600 men from a colony of 30,000, which is inside the replacement rate of the normal intake transport schedule, which means the colony would not even notice the gap. They loaded us onto the Harsh Amendment in the same hold configuration that I remembered from the Pergament, except that this time the restraint rails were bolted properly and there were arbiters in white uniforms stationed at every row, and before we shipped the arbiters fitted us with collars. Explosive collars. a metal band around the neck with a detonation charge sized to kill the wearer and nobody standing beside him, controlled by a remote held by the RB Tess attached to each penal squad. The collar was the weight of the thing that surprised me. I had expected it to feel like a sentence. It felt like a piece of plumbing. Cold metal, a hinge, a clasp, and a small light on the front that glowed a steady red. And I wore it for the next 9 months. And after the first week, I stopped feeling it the same way I had stopped tasting the grinite in my first months here, which is the body's way of telling you that the intolerable has become the baseline. The campaign was on a world called Drenavar, which I never saw properly because penal legionnaires are not briefed on the operational situation and are not told where they are being deployed or why. And the only information I received about Drenavar was what I could see from the inside of a Chimera troop carrier, which was mud and fire, and the backs of the men in front of me, and the sound of things hitting the hull that I later learned were shrapnel from artillery. We were attached to the Callsgrove 9th Line Infantry, which was a regular Astra Militarum regiment that had been fighting on Drenavar most of a year and had taken enough casualties that the Lord General commanding the theater had requisitioned penal reinforcements, which is the polite term for it. The less polite term is what the guardsmen called us when we dismounted from the carriers and walked past their positions towards the front, and I will not repeat what they called us because the words were not interesting, only the tone, which was the tone of men watching a delivery of something they had ordered and did not particularly want but needed, the way you might watch a crate of replacement parts arrive for a machine you wish you did not have to use. I understood the Callsgrove 9th within about a day, because they were a processing line, and I had worked one most of my life. Material comes in one end, material goes out the other. The rate at which it goes out is fixed by the slowest stage, and everything upstream is tuned to keep that stage fed. On Kelvadden, the slowest stage was the primary crusher. On Drenavar, the slowest stage was a trench line across open ground, and we were the feed. The only genuinely new thing was the crate we came out of. Everything else I had already seen, standing in the same room on a planet where the raw material could not shoot back. Guard equipment was another education. I had spent my life keeping a 600-year-old crusher turning with a pry bar and a wire brush, and whatever the supply barge had failed to lose, and I arrived on Drenavar expecting the real army to be different. The Callsgrove 9th had a single working Vox set per company, and a repair pool consisting of a corporal who had once been apprenticed to a clocksmith. The Imperium has 1,000,000 worlds. Not one of them had sent that regiment a second Vox set. The fighting is not the part worth your time. This is, we were sent forward in groups of 50, each group led by a single overseer with a remote for the collars and a lascarbine, and the legal authority to detonate any collar at any time for any reason classified as disciplinary necessity. And disciplinary necessity included retreating without authorization, which meant that the direction of movement was forward, and the only alternative to forward was the collar. And the collar was faster than whatever was in front of us. And so we went forward into positions that the regular guard had decided were too costly to assault with soldiers who were expected to survive. We were not expected to survive. I read the requisition form years later on a cooling repair while I was lying under a cogitator housing waiting for a coolant line to bleed down, and the open drawer of the cabinet above me was at the exact height of my face, and the form listed our designation as expendable combat augmentation, and our projected survival rate as 8%, and 8% of 600 is 48. And in the end, 39 of us came back, which is below projection, and I am certain that a clerk somewhere noted the discrepancy and adjusted the model for next time. I survived because of a wall. On the fourth day, our 50 was sent across open ground towards a trench line with heavy weapons emplaced along it, wide open, flat as a processing table. The first heavy bolter round hit the line before we were halfway, and men started coming apart around me, and I ran right instead of forward, because forward was where the rounds were landing, and right had a wall on it, a broken stub of masonry off a building destroyed weeks earlier. I threw myself behind it and lay there most of a day, while the assault continued and failed, and was reinforced and continued and failed again. The wall held because it was not a military obstacle. It was rubble, and nobody was aiming at rubble. By the time the assault finally succeeded, I was the last man from my 50. Overseer was dead, and the remote for my collar was somewhere under a body I could not identify, because there was not enough of him left to have a face. I wore the collar for 5 more months because nobody had the authorization to remove it. Not the replacement overseer who had a remote for his own squad, and not for mine. They folded me into another 50. That is the whole administrative response to a section becoming one man. The man carrying the remote for that role had a code for every man on it except me, and nobody told him, and there was no line on any form where the difference would have shown. A strength return says 50 collars. 50 collars is what it said, so for months I went forward with nothing behind me making me. I went when the others went, at the same speed, in the same direction. Drenevar had no direction that was not somebody's rear area. Desertion is a capital offense, and the only door off that world was a processing point with a clerk behind it. Not the Callsgrove Ninth's officers, who did not have the deactivation codes. Not the field medici who examined me after the assault and noted in my file that the collar was active, but that the control remote was listed as destroyed, and the risk assessment for leaving it in place was, and I remember the phrasing because I read it later, acceptable given operational tempo. I fought 5 more months with a live explosive collar around my neck, and a dead man's remote somewhere in the mud of a field I could not return to. And every morning I woke up and the red light was still on, and every night I went to sleep and the red light was still on, and I never learned whether the collar would have detonated if I had run, because the remote was destroyed and nobody knew whether a destroyed remote left the collar in armed standby or fail-safe, and nobody was willing to test the question, least of all me. When the campaign ended, or when our part of it ended, the surviving penal legionnaires were collected and processed. Processed. That word again. Processing on Drenevar meant standing in a line at a field depot while a munitorum clerk checked your number against a file and decided what to do with you, and what to do with you depended on where you had come from. And where I had come from was Penal Colony Kelvadden, and the file for Penal Colony Kelvadden said that Penal Legion survivors drawn from fixed penal installations were to be returned to their originating facility upon completion of the campaign, because the originating facility had allocated the personnel against its own strength return, and the personnel were still carried on the facility's role and the facility's quota. Projection assumed their return or replacement. The clerk read this off his data slate in the tone of a man who had read it several hundred times and had stopped wondering what it meant. "Does surviving this get me released?" I said. He looked at me. Then he looked at his screen, which is the order those two things happen in when the answer is already known, and the screen is being used as furniture. He turned the slate a few degrees towards himself. "Your file shows released inmate. Release is handled by the originating facility, and I cannot modify a designation set by another installation. And if I walk away from here, that is desertion from a munitorum processing point. Desertion is a capital offense." He turned the data slate a few degrees towards himself, which I have come to understand is what a clerk does, instead of raising his voice. Do you want me to enter that? I did not want him to enter that. I went back to the line. I got on the transport. I went back to Kelvadden. The collar was removed when I arrived. One of the Enclave servitors cut it off with a torch, guided by an adept who did not look at me once, because the collar was munitorum property being struck off a manifest, and the manifest was the only part of the transaction that concerned him. The collar came apart on the floor, and the red light went out, and the servitor swept both pieces into a parts bin and went back to whatever it had been doing. I sat there a while, feeling the air on my neck. It was the first time in the better part of a year that air had touched that skin, and it felt cold, and the skin underneath was white and wrinkled, and there was a line around my throat like a scar that was not a scar. I still have the line. Sometimes at night, when the dormitory is quiet and the lumen strips are at their lowest setting, I trace it with a fingertip and think about the red light and the wall and the remote somewhere in the mud on a world whose name I can barely remember. Then I stop because thinking about it does not change anything, and I have the morning shift before long, and the secondary crusher bearing needs checking. I came back to Section 7, and my bunk was occupied by someone else, and my position at the primary crusher had been filled by a man named Lenk, and Horab was dead. Not the way Vetch went. Nobody took Horab. His lungs took him on his own bunk over about a month, the same as they take the men who never controlled anything at all, and by the account I was given, he was still directing the movement of filters and ration supplements from that bunk in the last week, from memory, because he had never written any of it down. A man called Tessimer had the section now. He had not fought anybody for it. He had simply been standing closest to it when it came free, and he ran it with the same pipe and the same understanding and the same arrangement with the RB Tess, who needed somebody to manage the section. And I was in my 30s, and I had been to war, and I had survived, and the colony had not noticed I was gone. I got a new bunk. I did not get my old position back because Lenk knew the crusher now, and Lenk was younger, and Lenk did not cough. What I got was a maintenance role, which meant I walked the processing line and checked the equipment and reported faults, because I knew every machine in Section 7 and Lenk only knew the crusher, and knowing every machine made me more useful as a general maintenance monitor than as a single station operator. Tessimer came to me within the first week, the way Horab had come to me years before, because the arrangement does not care who holds the pipe. The arrangement cares about output, and output requires machines that run, and machines that run require the man who knows why they have stopped. Lenk lasted a few years. The crusher took his right hand at the wrist on a day when the feed hopper jammed, and he reached in to clear it without locking the drive, which is the one thing I would have told him never to do if he had ever asked, and he had never asked because asking would have meant acknowledging that he needed something from me, and acknowledging that he needed something from me would have reduced his value and increased mine. And on Kelvadden, value is a balance sheet, and the balance does not tolerate generosity. After the medical orderly cauterized the stump with the same coagulant spray he used on everything else, Lenk was reassigned to the separation tables, and I went back to the crusher, and I have been at the crusher ever since, and the crusher has been running ever since, and the ingots stack, and the freighter comes, and the freighter goes, and the system feeds itself, and I feed the system. The years in the middle of my life here were a single shift that lasted a decade and a half. I cannot tell you what happened in most of them, because the same thing happened every day, and the same thing happening every day is the same as nothing happening at all. That is the real punishment of Kelvadden, not the pain, the sameness. Days identical to the days before them and the days after them, until time itself becomes another machine running without maintenance, and the date on the work chit stops meaning anything, the same way the taste stopped meaning anything. Belief is the first thing this place takes off you and the last thing it gives back. There is a confessor on Kelvadden. I should mention him because his existence is one of those facts about the colony that sounds like it means something and does not. Confessor Aldenarch arrived in my 7th year, assigned by the Ministorum as part of a sector-wide initiative to provide spiritual guidance to penal populations, and he has been here ever since, which makes him the longest-serving member of the official staff and one of the few people on the colony who chose to be here. Although I have always suspected that the choice was between Kelvadden and something worse, because a man does not volunteer for a penal colony without having a reason not to be somewhere else. Aldenarch holds devotions every 7th day in a room that used to be a storage bay, and that he has converted into a chapel by the addition of a small aquila mounted on the wall and a row of benches made from cargo pallets. And the devotions are attended by anything from a dozen to a room full, depending on the shift schedule, and the men who attend do so for one of a short list of reasons. They genuinely believe, which accounts for about 4 of them. They want to sit on something other than a bunk for an hour, which accounts for about 20. Or they have been told to attend by whichever man controls their section, because maintaining a relationship with the confessor is useful for reasons I will explain. The reason is this. Aldenarch writes letters, not for the inmates, for the administrative block. Once a year, the confessor submits a spiritual welfare assessment to the governor-warden, and the governor-warden is required by regulation to include this assessment in the annual report to the Arbitesses Command on the subsector capital, and the assessment includes a section on conditions, and the conditions section is the only part of the annual report that is not written by someone whose continued employment depends on the conditions being described as adequate. Aldenarch has filed one assessment for every year I have known him, and every one of them has described the conditions as requiring improvement, and every one of them has been included in the annual report, and not once has the subsector capital responded to any of them, and Aldenarch continues to write them every year with the same careful penmanship and the same measured language and the same complete absence of expectation that anything will come of it. I asked him once why he kept writing if nobody read it. The writing is the part I am responsible for, he said. The reading is not. 36 of them. Nobody has ever answered one. A record that exists is not the same object as a record that does not exist. He was cleaning the aquila while he said this, with a rag, the way I clean a screen. One day somebody may open a file on this place, and the question that day will be whether anything is in it. Between one day and never there is a space. That space is the whole of my work. I did not argue with him. I do not argue with men who have found a way to survive here that does not involve knowing how to fix a crusher, and his way is no more absurd than mine, and the powder does not care which of them you chose. It kills a believer and a maintenance man on the same schedule. The only difference is what you are holding when it finishes. The riot changed one thing. Afterwards, Branno needed to replace 112 dead men in Section 12, and the intake transports could not cover the deficit fast enough, so she transferred men in from other sections, which does not replace 129 and was never going to, and the difference was made up the way every difference here is made up, which is by the men who were still standing working it. Section 7 lost 8, and among those 8 was Sedic, the man whose arm the overseers had ruined. Sedic went to Section 12 and worked the shafts one-armed until his lungs quit, and the transfer report classified him as voluntarily reassigned, which was accurate in the same way that a man who jumps from a roof because the building is on fire has voluntarily chosen the ground. I mention Sedek because I had worked at the next station to him for the better part of 2 decades, and because his departure was the first time I understood that the colony does not just take people away, it moves them around like parts in a machine. And the parts do not have opinions about where they are installed, and if a part complains, the machine has other parts. Branno served as Governor Warden for 14 years. She died the way she ran the colony, efficiently. She tripped on a stairwell in the administrative block and broke her neck. The stairwell had no lumen casters because Branno had removed them years earlier to reduce power consumption. Durham filed the incident as an accidental fall. It was Durham who had turned the guns onto the yard for her, on her word, and had not spoken once through the 18 hours that led to it. He had also, according to the maintenance logs that I reviewed, because I am the man who reviews the maintenance logs, been the last person to access the administrative block stairwell that evening, because the blast door entry records showed his transponder code going in that evening, and Branno's body was found later that night, and nobody else's code appeared in between. I did not report it. Durham controlled the blast doors, the armory, the turrets, and the air, and he was also the only man I could have reported it to. The colony ran better after Branno was dead, and that is the only verdict this place has ever taken an interest in. The third Governor Warden, a man named Gralund, arrived within a couple of months and immediately reduced the quotas to where Thuld had set them, and said nothing about the reduction, and the colony went back to its baseline mortality rate, and the intake transports kept arriving every few months with new batches of men, younger every year it seemed, boys who looked the way I must have looked at the start, with pink brands on their hands and coveralls that did not fit, and the particular expression of someone who has just realized that the word sentence does not contain the word end. Now, the day I found out I was free. I use the word free in the administrative sense, which is the only sense it has ever had on Kelvadden, and which I have already demonstrated means nothing at all. But this was different from the release that meant nothing, because this was not a release, it was a commutation, and a commutation is not the same as a release, and the difference between them is the difference between a door that is locked and a door that was never there. It happened in my 37th year. I was 52. A clerk in the administrative block, a man named Bletton, died of the same lung condition that kills everyone who stays here long enough. Bletton had been an inmate himself, convicted of fraud on a merchant world in the next subsector, and he had served his sentence and entered the release queue and done what every man in the release queue eventually does, which is stop waiting. And at some point during his waiting, he had been assigned to a clerical position in the administrative block because he could read and write and operate a cogitator terminal. Clerical positions in the administrative block are filled by inmates because the arbitres do not type. The administratum does not send clerks to penal colonies, and someone has to enter the data. Bletton entered data for more than 2 decades with the same quiet efficiency as the terminal he sat at. He died at his desk. The orderly who came for the body had to pry his fingers off the data slate because the hands had stiffened around it. When they cleared Bletton's effects, which is a process that involves a single arbites officer walking through the dead man's workspace and putting anything of administrative significance into a box for review, the officer found a drawer. The drawer was locked. The lock was not standard issue. It was a lock that Bletton had built himself out of parts taken from the maintenance stores over a period of years. And it was better than anything the administrative block had, and the officer could not open it. And so he did what everybody on Kelvadden does when a mechanism will not do what it is supposed to do, which is send for the inmate who understands mechanisms. That is how I came to be standing in a dead man's office with a pry bar in my hand and an arbites officer at my shoulder telling me to hurry up. It took me 4 minutes. It would have taken half that if I had wanted it to, but I had already seen through the gap what was in there, and paper is not a thing you see in the administrative block, and I wanted the extra time. Not data slates. Paper. Actual physical documents, the kind that arrive by courier rather than by data transfer. The kind that carry seals and stamps and require a physical signature and are filed in a physical location because the system they belong to predates cogitator networks by several thousand years and nobody has ever updated it. There were 47 documents in the drawer. Every one of them was a commutation order. Each had been issued by a tribunal or an arbitres court on a world somewhere else in the subsector, and every one of them had been transmitted to Penal Colony Kelvadden by courier, and every one of them instructed the governor-warden to remove the named inmate from the colony's rolls and release them immediately, and every one of them had been received by Blettin and filed in his locked drawer and never actioned. Nobody reads that many documents in 4 minutes. I read numbers. After a lifetime, there is exactly one string of 6 digits in the galaxy that I will find on a page without looking for it. Mine was 9th from the top. It was dated 22 years earlier. It had been issued by the Appellate Division of the Rostvik Hive Judiciary, which is an office I did not know existed, on the grounds that a review of administrative sabotage convictions involving juvenile offenders had determined that the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines applied to my case had been superseded by a revised code before my conviction, and under the revised code my offense carried a maximum sentence of 4 years, not 12. And since I had already served 12 years at the time the review was conducted, the sentence was commuted with immediate effect, and the governor-warden was instructed to process my release within 30 days. 30 days. I read it again, and the number did not change, and I put the paper back in the box and went to the line and checked the bearing housing, which needed checking. The paper was 22 years old. Nobody had ever followed up. Blettin had it in his drawer the whole time. Every quarter I walked to that window and asked, and every quarter he said, "Not this transport," and looked at the next chit, and the answer was an arm's length behind him in a locked drawer he had built himself. The system had not broken. It was never designed to release people. It was designed to process paper, and the paper had been processed. 26 of them were for men still alive and still working on this colony, legally free for anything from a few years to most of a lifetime, and not one of them knew. The oldest was dated before I arrived, and the name on it was Treithoven, who was still tightening clamps in Section 4 on the day the drawer came open, with weeks left. Blettin did not bury them out of malice. A body that leaves has to be replaced, and replacement is slow, and the gap is a line in the governor-warden's report, and a line in that report is a question from the subsector capital. He buried 47 men's freedom out of compliance. He was the most diligent clerk I have ever known. The box went up to Prefect Durnham, and Durnham sent it to Governor-Warden Grolland, and Grolland reviewed them and issued 26 notifications. That took 9 weeks. For 9 weeks, I was the only man on the wrong side of the blast doors who knew those documents existed. I did nothing. I did not tell Grun. I did not tell the confessor, who would have put it in an assessment. Nobody reads but which exists, and by his own argument, that is the whole difference between one day and never. I told myself I had 4 minutes and a pry bar and no way to prove anything, which was true, and that a man found reading a sealed drawer does not get sent to fix the cooling again, which was also true, and neither was why. In the 7th of those 9 weeks, Treithoven went into the slag pit. I had seen his number on that paper. I did not go to Section 4, which is a short walk from where I stand along a corridor I use twice a day, and which I had walked to 100 times over the years to be told one true thing about somebody's home world. He did not die of anything dramatic. His lungs finished, the way mine are finishing, on a normal shift between one clamp and the next. The notifications went out and his came back to the administrative block marked deceased and filed, and the filing was correct, and everything about it was correct. And I have been the man who did not make that walk ever since. The notifications informed the surviving men that their commutations had been received and would be processed in accordance with the standard release schedule. The standard release schedule. The same quarterly transport, the same priority queue, the same berth capacity that was never sufficient, the same system that had kept me classified as released inmate for years before I stopped checking. 26 men were told they were free, and the freedom was worth exactly what it had always been worth, which was a word on a form and nothing else. 3 of them asked to see the confessor. 1 of them asked to see the medical orderly. 2 of them stopped working and were beaten by overseers and went back to work. The rest did nothing. I did nothing. What was there to do? The primary crusher needed its bearing checked, and the secondary auger was running hot, and the separation table screens had not been cleaned since the previous shift, and the machines did not care about commutation orders, and I was the only man who understood the machines, and the machines were the only thing keeping me alive, and being alive was the only thing I had. I am 58. My lungs sound like somebody crumpling parchment inside my chest. My hands are scarred from a lifetime of solvents and hot metal and wire brushes. My teeth are the color of old bone, and my skin is the color of the sky here, because the granite does not only settle in your lungs, it settles everywhere. And after enough years, the distinction between the man and the colony is a formality the paperwork keeps up and the body abandoned. I am shorter than I was when I arrived. The spine compresses, the gravity is a little heavier than standard, and standing at machines does to a man what it does to any equipment nobody maintains. I have lived here longer than I lived on Rostvik, longer than most men live anywhere. It is not home because home is something you choose, but it is the place where I know where everything is. There are men here who have done years and do not know that the filtration system in Block 11 has a manual bypass valve behind a panel on the 3rd level, or that the primary filter clogs every 18 days, or that when it clogs, the air in Block 11 goes to a level the medical station would call hazardous, if anybody from the medical station had ever been to Block 11. Merken showed me that valve in my 2nd year. I have been opening it on that interval ever since, less the stretch I was off this planet when nobody opened it at all, and I came back to a stack that had to be stripped to the housing because the medium had set like mortar. What I know about this place is not wisdom, and it is not power. It is plumbing, and plumbing is what keeps a man alive, where the only question is whether the machine runs tomorrow. 6 months ago, a transmission arrived on Kelvadden. Not a supply manifest, not a personnel transport schedule, not a commutation order that would sit in a drawer until someone died. An official reclassification notice from the Administratum's Office of Planetary Designation, transmitted via astropathic relay, addressed to the Governor-Warden of Penal Colony Kelvadden, and carrying a second document folded inside it under the seal of the Departamento Munitorum, which is the part that mattered and which nobody read first. The notice informed Governor Warden Graland that the planetary classification of Kelvadden had been revised from Category Sigma Penal to Category Epsilon 7 Labor, effective upon receipt, and that all personnel records were to be updated accordingly, and that the reclassification had been prompted by a sector-wide review of resource extraction facilities conducted by the Departamento Munitorum in consultation with the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Office of the Lord Sector, and that the review had determined that certain penal installations whose primary function was industrial output rather than punitive detention would be more efficiently administered under labor classification, and that Kelvadden met the criteria for reclassification, and that further guidance regarding the administrative transition would be provided in due course. I was told about the reclassification by Tessimer's replacement, a man named Grun who controls Section 7 now, and who told me because I am the person Grun consults when something happens that he does not understand, and Grun does not understand most things, which is why he consults me. And my value to Grun is the same value I had to Horab and to Tessimer before him, which is the value of the man who knows where the valves are. I listened to what Grun told me, and I asked him what labor classification meant, and he said he did not know. And I said I would find out. And I walked to the administrative block and stood at the intercom and asked, and the clerk on the other side of the intercom, who was the third clerk to occupy Bletton's desk since Bletton had died, told me that labor classification meant that the facility's population was no longer categorized as penal inmates, but as labor assets, and that labor assets were subject to the same tithe obligations as any other imperial labor population, which included military conscription under Departamento Munitorum authority. So what does it mean for us? I said. It means this world carries a standing tithe, he said, assessed annually against population. Same as a factory world or a hive district or an agricultural settlement. He was reading. He had the notice open in front of him, and he was reading me the parts he thought I would understand. I told him the Munitorum had already taken 600 men off this rock in my 19th year and had not needed a reclassification to do it. He said that was a requisition, and a requisition is a thing a Lord General asks for when he is short. And those men went out as penal legionnaires under arbites collars against a campaign that was already running. A tithe is not asked for. A tithe is assessed, and it recurs, and it does not wait for a war to exist first. Then he said the sentence that I have been turning over ever since, and he said it without any weight at all, because to him it was a line about filing. Convict intake, he said, is allocated to facilities under penal designation, and the ones they do not take remain as labor assets, continue their work assignments. I stood at that grill and did the arithmetic. A third of any intake gone in the first year, the rest of us dying afterwards at the slower rate. Nothing born here, and 2 or 3 transports arriving for every freighter that left. That was the only reason this planet held 30,000 men. It was never a population. It was a flow. A man had just told me, in the voice of somebody reading a filing rule, that the intake side stops, and that a fresh draw against our numbers begins and recurs. Nobody has decided anything about us. They have closed one valve and opened another, and there is a date in the future when the last man on Kelvadden puts down a wrench. I could work it out in an afternoon. I have not wanted to. I asked him what the actual difference was between a penal inmate and a labor asset, and he looked at his data slate for a long time, longer than a man looks at a screen he is reading, and I understood that he was looking at it so that he would not have to look at the grill. The classification code on the file header, he said. I let that sit to see whether he would add anything to it. The code on the file header. That is the difference, he said, and now he did read it out properly, because reading it out properly was easier than the silence. Labor assets cannot be given punitive extensions or solitary confinement, because those are penal measures, and this is no longer a penal facility. Labor assets may file grievance reports through the Administratum Standard Labor Complaint Mechanism. How long does a grievance take? He did not look up. Average processing time is 9 years. Grahland understood the arithmetic before I did. He has an office and the full returns, and he had months on me. What he did with them I know in 2 ways, and they are not worth the same. He did not ask for the designation to be reversed. He could not. A request to reverse it is a statement that the Administratum's own efficiency review reached the wrong answer about this world, and a statement like that does not get quietly corrected. It gets inspected, and an inspector on Kelvadden would find several things before he found the classification error. So Grahland did the 2 things the system leaves open to a man in his position. The first I know because I was in the administrative block in the 2nd month on the cooling, and there was a docket face up on the desk I was working beside. Application for labor draft allocation. I read the header and the disposition line and nothing else, because a man seen reading in that room does not get sent to fix the cooling again. It enters this world in a queue against every other labor world in the subsector, and Kelvadden is the posting men on other worlds are threatened with. Nothing has come since, and there is no version of this where anybody tells me why. The second I know from underneath, the way every man here knows things. He raised the quota. The first thing Grahland ever did on this planet was lower it. That was his whole reputation in the sections, the one who put it back. Now he has moved it the other way, and every man who was here for both understands what that means without being told, not by a third. He never met Branno, but he inherited her file and her figures, and whatever the file says about how she died, the output curve in it says everything else. So he raised it by an amount nobody has complained about out loud. The shift is longer than it was at the turn of the year. 2 men on the separation tables have gone into the medical block this quarter with hands they could not open, and 1 has not come back. Nobody died of the new quota. That is the point of the new quota. The men who can meet it are standing here now, and in a few years a number of them will not be, and output banked this year exists on a return. He is not saving the colony. There is no procedure for saving a colony. He is making the decline look gradual, because a gradual decline is a trend, and a trend is somebody else's problem in somebody else's posting, and a sudden one is a question with his name at the bottom. I thanked the clerk and walked back to Section 7, and on the way I worked out the one thing the reclassification had handed me. A penal facility can extend a sentence and put a man in a hole in the dark, and I have watched both happen to men who talked. There is no sentence left to extend, because a labor asset does not have one. And solitary is a penal measure, and penal measures are not available here. It is not safe. 2 of the 3 punishments are gone, and the 3rd is still on the wall in the section office. Nobody needs a classification to put a name on the surface roster, and a full shift outside at 58 with these lungs is not a punishment. It is a scheduling decision with an outcome. What I have is what I have always had, which is that the machines stop when I stop. And none of the men above Grun wants to be the name on the return, explaining a fortnight of lost output. That is not protection. That is a price. So I talk at the machines. There is always somebody at the next station who cannot leave either, and the noise covers it. I went to see the confessor after that. He had already worked it out and had been sitting with it some days. The office at the end of his route supervises penal installations. This is not one anymore. Nobody has told him to stop, because nobody has thought about him at all. He will write the next one, and Grahland will accept it, and it will travel attached to a report that now arrives at a different desk in a different department, and that department administers labor worlds, and there is no clerk in it whose function is to read a paragraph about conditions. He told me this himself, standing, holding the rag, and did not appear distressed. I asked whether he was going to keep writing them. The writing is the part I am responsible for. The reading is not, word for word, what he told me the first time I ever asked him anything. I do not think he knew he was repeating himself. One notice arrived and took his method off him and left mine standing, and the only reason mine is standing is that a crusher does not care what a world is classified as. That is not a better argument. It is a better machine. The Munitorum assessors arrived within the month. 4 of them, clean uniforms, data slates, and measuring tapes, and the faintly appalled look of men told they were visiting an industrial facility. They walked the colony in pairs under arbatesse escort and measured men. Height, weight, arm span, grip, eyes, lungs. They carried a checklist, and the checklist had thresholds. If you met them, your name went on a list, and the list went on a transport, and the transport went to a Munitorum depot, and the depot issued you a lasgun and a uniform and a regimental number, and you were a guardsman. They did not walk 30,000 men past a measuring tape. They worked off the files and put hands only on the short list. 2 fields decide it. Date of arrival, because lungs are a function of how long you have been breathing here, and the annotation the medical orderly enters on your quarterly check. An orderly with a few minutes for each of us writes stable, or he writes something else. He is not making a judgment about anybody's future. He is clearing a queue, and he has been clearing it his whole working life, and nobody ever told him what the field was for. It turns out it is for this. I knew who would be on that list before the assessors finished their first day, because I had put a lot of them there. Grun sends every new assignment to me, and so did the man before him, so anybody who came into this section in recent years has stood beside me at a machine while I told him which noise means stop. A man who learns the machines does not go on the surface roster, and a man off the surface roster still has lungs while he is young, and a young man with lungs has the word stable in the only field the assessors read. I taught them the thing that keeps you alive here. That is the thing that made them worth taking. Not one of those 412 was pardoned. No tribunals sat. No sentence was set aside. No offense was struck off anything. Every man who walked up that ramp was as guilty on the day he boarded as on the day they burned a number into his hand. 19 years ago, the Munitorum came for 600 of the same men and put collars on every one, because that is what the Imperium does with a convict it means to spend. And the collar is not cruelty. It is a filing category with a hinge on it. An assessor drafting against a tithe does not read an offense record. He has no reason to. He reads a header and a fitness score and a name, and writes the name down or does not. Those headers had been rewritten months earlier by an office 9 jumps away correcting an inefficiency in how extraction facilities are administered. Nobody forgave anybody. The code at the top of the page changed, and a man who would have gone out in a collar to be spent in front of a trench went out with a lasgun and a uniform with no stripe on it, standing beside men tithed off farms. It was not mercy. Mercy requires somebody to have looked, and a header is the thing that saves you from looking. They did not measure me. I was standing at my usual position next to the secondary crusher, checking the bearing temperature with my palm the way I was taught to on my 9th day here, and the assessor walked past me and looked at his checklist and walked past without stopping, because I am 58 years old, and there is not much of me left, and my lungs sound like crumpling parchment, and my grip strength would not pass the minimum threshold for a lascarbine, and the Munitorum does not want components that are already worn past their service life. They measured 700 men and took 412. Young men, mostly. Men whose lungs had not yet filled with granite powder. Men who could still hold a weapon and run and do the things that soldiers do. They walked to the landing field and boarded a transport, and the transport lifted off, and the landing field was empty, and the quarterly quota did not change, and the remaining population absorbed the workload, the way it always absorbs losses, by working harder and dying faster. I watched them go from the maintenance bay window, which is a slit about as wide as a hand, and I watched the transport rise through the yellow sky until it was a dot, and then nothing. And the crusher was running behind me with the same low vibration I have felt through the soles of my feet since I was 15. And I turned around and went back to work because there was nothing else to turn towards. A citizen, a convict, an inmate, a released inmate, a penal legionnaire, a returned asset, a commuted prisoner, a labor unit. 8 words in 8 files, administering one man who has not moved. The machine moved around me. I have stood here with this cough and these hands and this line around my throat where the caller sat, and watched it reclassify me the way it reclassifies everything, which is by changing the paperwork and leaving the thing itself where it was. The man standing at the next station is 16 years old. He came in on the last intake transport, and I mean that the way the schedule means it, because convict intake is allocated to facilities under penal designation, and this facility no longer holds one. Men will be brought here again eventually, when somebody in an office needs somewhere to put a labor draft, and they will not be convicts, and they will not be soon. He is the last one. Brand still pink, no cough yet, and a number he has not yet forgotten is not his name. He stole ration supplements on a hive world I have never heard of. Grun sent him to me because Grun sends every new assignment to me, and I showed him the crushers and the separation tables, and the smelting furnace and the feed conveyor and the bypass valve behind the panel on the 3rd level of Block 11. Then I put his hand flat on the primary crusher housing while it was running and held it there, and I did not let go. And after a while I moved it a hand's width along, and held it there too, and then I took my hand off his and waited. It took him longer than it took me. He got there. He said the bearing, and I grunted and walked off, because that is the whole of the lesson, and anything else you add to it is decoration. He will start every shift that way now for as long as he has shifts. I have given him everything. The valve, the intervals, the noises, all of it in a month. I said earlier that I have never taught anybody everything I know. That was never a principle. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic has changed. Exclusive knowledge is worth something on a world that will need you tomorrow. I have worked out how many tomorrows this one has, and it did not take me long, and I have been carrying the number since. There is nothing clean in it. The men on that transport were fit to be taken because somebody kept them useful, and I am doing to this boy exactly what I did to them. He looked at me the way I looked at Merkin with his hand holding mine down on a running housing, which is the way a piece of equipment looks at the only man who understands the machine it has been put inside. His number is 91347. His name does not matter. Mine did not either.